Okay, thanks, Denise. And welcome attendees to our 6th webinar in our 8 parts Resilience Toolkit series with Melanie Lockwood Herman with the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. My name is Ashley Freevert, Senior Associate with the Partnerships Cares Project. And we can go to the next slide. So before we get started, we'd like to center ourselves in why we do what we do with the promise of community action, and you are welcome to recite along with me behind your screens. Community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, well, today, Melanie Lockwood Herman will take us through Ready to Serve, how to build and equip a crisis-ready response team. Again, Melanie is Executive Director of the Nonprofit Risk Management Center and has delivered countless workshops, seminars, and keynote presentations for organizations. She's authored more than a dozen comprehensive guides on various risk management topics, and we are so grateful to have such a high caliber expert providing education to the Community Action Network. So with that, Melanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and also Denise. It's my pleasure to be back with you for this session, number 6 in our series of 8 on resilience-related topics. If you've heard me speak before, you know that I always want to provide my phone number and my email address to encourage you to reach out. Sometimes there are questions that pop up during a webinar, and if so, you can certainly use the chat feature to let me know what your thoughts are, your comments, your questions as we go along. But sometimes there are questions that come up that you'd rather talk with somebody one-on-one in more of a confidential setting. So please feel free to reach out to me with those questions. When our phone rings here at the Nonprofit Risk Management Center, we're always excited to see that it's someone calling from a community action agency. We love to help you, whether it's getting access to some of the tools that we've created, or whether it's just brainstorming with you about a question or an issue that you're facing. So don't hesitate to use that phone number. That is our general office phone number, and either I or a member of my team will answer. And again, we're happy to help you in any way that we possibly can. On this next slide, I've just reminded you who we are. The Nonprofit Risk Management Center is a nonprofit that helps other nonprofits as well as public agencies. And we've been working with community action agencies for the last 15 years or so. So it's been certainly our honor to support this community in many different ways. We try to help leadership teams, both managers and executives at community action agencies and other organizations, think about risk, get comfortable with risk, and really feel good about taking risks. We think that a lot of organizations are a bit too risk averse, and we want to encourage you and hope that you get to a place where you feel good about the risks you face so that ultimately you can take more risk to advance your mission. So that's what we're all about. For today's webinar, I've broken the content into 3 sections. We're going to start with a quick review of what is a crisis, what is crisis communications, and what is a crisis communications plan. And whenever I'm teaching, I always like to start with definitions. I always like to get grounded in definitions, because what I've discovered is that many of us use terms quite frequently, but we understand them differently. And so before I start telling you how to do something, I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. So that's where we will start this journey this afternoon. And then I want to dive into what I'm calling 3 strategies to build and equip a crisis-ready response team. So really the crux of the topic that we're exploring today. And then, as I usually do, I like to close with some tips and some takeaways. And really, these are things that have inspired me. If you've heard me speak before, if you've listened to any of our webinars, you know that I'm an avid reader, and I'm constantly trying to learn and add to what I know and understand, not only about risk management, but about managing people, about organizations, about dealing with things like crisis events. And so I often find inspiration in what I'm reading, and I try to apply that to the work that I'm doing, which often includes teaching sessions like this one. So I'll close with some tips, and I hope those words of inspiration from articles and books that I've been reading will be inspiring to you as well. So let's go ahead and jump into the definitions and make sure we're on the same page when we use these terms. So the first definition is a crisis. Since we're talking about a crisis-ready response team, what types of things will that team be managing, right? What will they be doing? What will they be focused on? And this is a definition that I encountered many years ago. It was in a little book published by the Harvard Business Press. It's part of their Pocket Mentor series. And it was called the Pocket Mentor series because the book was a very slim format that would fit in a suit pocket. And I remember I purchased this book at an airport bookstore many, many years ago, probably 20 years ago. But I liked this definition. This was the one thing that really struck me from the book. And that was the idea that a crisis is a change which could be sudden, happens all at once, or evolving, right? It gets worse over time, that results in an urgent problem that must be addressed immediately. You know, I love this definition for several reasons. First of all, it's a pretty straightforward sentence, and it really draws our attention to the fact that a crisis is a change that could be either sudden or evolving, so they happen in different ways. Sometimes it's referred to as a snowball crisis. That's the evolving crisis, one that just is getting bigger and bigger and bigger until finally it's right in front of you, versus a spotlight crisis, one that suddenly you see, you know, you're in crisis mode. But I like the fact that this definition tells us that a crisis is an urgent problem. So it's not a problem that we've been dealing with day after day after day. It's something that's urgent. We have to address it immediately. So if you've got a problem that you're going to take the next 6 months to figure out, it's probably not a crisis. One of the mistakes I think that many of us make is that we use the term crisis when we're really just referring to something happening in our agencies that we need to fix. So here's another definition of crisis that I thought was helpful and instructive from Sage Publications. And in this definition, the writer is suggesting that there are three major elements of a crisis. That it's a crisis if it's a surprise, so it's something that's happened we weren't expecting. There's a threat, so there's a potential for things to go terribly wrong, and we need to address it in a short period of time, right? So it goes back to that other definition of addressing it immediately. I underlined two words in this definition because I thought this was really nice, the way the author said that because of this uncertainty, this event, this crisis presents an organization with both opportunities for and threats to its high priority goals. And what this reminds us of is the fact that with any risk event, with any crisis event, there's always going to be an opportunity for our team to shine and show what we're made of, and really show how deep our commitment to our mission is and how deep our commitment to our community is. But there's also that opportunity to screw up and make some terrible mistakes and cause permanent damage to our reputation. And of course, there can be lots of other types of fallout from a crisis. People can lose their jobs. Clients find that they can go elsewhere for services, right? So they stop coming to your agency as their primary service provider. So I love this idea that in a crisis, there are opportunities to advance and lift up and fortify our goals and priorities, but there are also potential threats, right? So there's danger. So anyways, two different definitions of what is a crisis. Now let's talk about what is crisis communications, because much of what a crisis-ready response team will be doing is communicating. So for this topic, or for this term, I chose three different definitions from very different sources, right? So the first is from Wikipedia, right? The free online encyclopedia that's created and maintained by volunteers. So Wikipedia thinks of crisis communications, or at least the author of the page on this topic, thinks of crisis communications as kind of a subspecialty of public relations. I found this very interesting, and I wanted to share it with you because I've never thought of crisis communications that way, that it's a subset of public relations. Most nonprofits don't have a public relations office, right? Most public agencies don't have a public relations office. They have some sort of communications team or an individual who's responsible for communicating with external stakeholders, but we don't typically have PR offices. That's very corporate, that language. But I liked it. I like this definition because it reminds us that how we communicate in a crisis and the effectiveness of our crisis-ready response team will be potentially helpful to our reputation, will help promote the organization and increase awareness and all those positive feelings that people have about the organization, or of course the opposite. So the next definition is from Rock Dove Solutions, which is a technology company. And Rock Dove says that crisis communications is all about those systems, those tools, the protocols that help you communicate during an emergency situation. I like this definition because it reminds us that crisis communications isn't just or isn't limited to a spokesperson standing in front of a podium talking to the media, right? Doing a press conference. That may be part of it, but that's not the whole piece. And nowadays, many organizations are using technology tools as a way to quickly communicate with many different people. And a great example of that would be those tools that allow you to call phones, leave text messages with hundreds, if not thousands of people at the same time. I experienced this technology firsthand as a parent of a middle schooler. And anytime my daughter's middle school did a drill, they would send this test alert message, and my work phone would ring, my cell phone would ring, and I'd get an email and a text message, and my home phone would ring as well. So they used 5 different ways to communicate with me, all instantaneously. And obviously there wasn't somebody sitting with a phone calling me, right? This is all automated. So that type of tool can be incredibly useful. And then the last definition here is from the Business Dictionary, and it just says that it's about the effort taken by a company to communicate with the public, right? Especially when there's an event that's occurred that could have a negative impact on the organization's reputation. So 3 different definitions of crisis communications. And on this next slide, I've created my own version of these definitions. I've tried to kind of marry some of the concepts from these last few sources. And I'm calling crisis communications mission-focused messaging and dialogue with vital stakeholders during a crisis. So I put mission focused right at the beginning of my definition because I wanted to emphasize that when you and I are communicating on behalf of a nonprofit organization or on behalf of a public agency, when we're communicating with the public in a crisis, we have to remember at all cost that our mission has to come first, and we should lead with our mission. So it's a good reminder. I put it in the beginning of that definition. And then an alternative is just informing your community with mission-focused messaging, inspiring confidence and comfort in times of crisis. So I like this idea of this trying to strike a balance between confidence, we're doing everything we can to deal with the situation, and we're here. We're here to help you. If you have questions, please call us. I think that as you work with your crisis response team, as you build a crisis response team, as you train your spokespersons, the people that will represent your organization in a crisis, I want you to make sure that they understand those 2 messages, the confidence, inspiring confidence, and providing comfort are equally important, and they should be kind of the backdrop, kind of the guiding principles behind your crisis communications. So the final definition is crisis communications plan. What is a crisis communication plan? Well, it could be lots of different things in many different types of organizations. I've tried to kind of simplify it here and say that, a crisis communications plan should explain who is authorized to speak and who isn't authorized to speak. One of the mistakes that so many agencies have encountered is they fail to tell members of the staff that you are not the spokesperson. And therefore, when the media calls you for information on a crisis, your job is to get that person's information and pass that call over to the spokesperson, the official spokesperson. And the fact of the matter is that employees of your agency want to be helpful, right? We're in the business of helping people. And so when somebody calls with a question, our first instinct is to try to answer the question. But if you want to manage crisis communications effectively, you got to make sure that you've got those trained spokespeople who know what to say and how to say it and when to say it, and that you don't have every employee of your agency answering those questions. A crisis communications plan should also explain who's in the loop, right? who are the members of this crisis team, and who needs to be kept informed and apprised, right? So make sure at a minimum that you're not responding to a crisis, dealing with a crisis, interacting with the public and the media and your key stakeholders without keeping your board apprised of what's happening, right? No board likes to be in the dark. And there's great risk when you get out in front and you're kind of out there doing the thing that you're doing, particularly during a crisis, and your board is surprised, right? They had no idea this was going on. So we need to keep in mind that people need to be in a loop. The other thing that we often see in a good crisis communications plan are those materials that need to be produced, right? Those templated statements that you've drafted in advance of the crisis that you just need to customize once the crisis begins. I would also encourage you to include the names and contact information, email addresses, cell numbers of people that you might need to reach in an emergency. And you may be thinking, well, I already have those phone numbers in my phone, right? I know those people, but having them in this document is just a backup plan, right? It's a buffer. It helps you make sure that if something happens, right? If your phone is dead, if your phone is dropped in water and doesn't work any longer, you can go to another computer and pull up this plan, or you have a hard copy of the plan handy with those important phone numbers. I also encourage you to draft messages that can be tweaked to suit the crisis. Now, I hope you're not superstitious, but every once in a while when I teach crisis communications, I encounter someone who says, if we start to draft these messages, a terrible thing happened at our agency today, or, after the death of a client, or a horrible accident involving one of our vehicles, if we write those things down, aren't they more likely to happen? The answer is no. So getting ready and starting to prepare messages that can be customized to the circumstances will just get you closer to the finish line and better prepared and more confident when that crisis happens. So don't be superstitious about that. And then I mentioned, those key points of contact, not only internally, but you may have key points of contact, vendors, partner agencies, funders, media organizations in your community, and so forth. So there are lots of things that could be in lots of things that could be in a crisis communications plan. You get to decide, but these are some of the things I think are most valuable when you're putting one of these plans together. All right, we finished our definitions, and as Denise has chatted, feel free to chat any questions. And again, if you'd like to talk with me one-on-one, I'd be more than happy to do that. Just give me a call or send me an email, and we could set that up. All right, so let's head into 3 strategies to build and equip a crisis-ready team. So the framework for this section of the presentation is reflect, plan, and practice, right? I think in so many instances when we're trying to do something, we jump to the doing without spending enough time reflecting. And unless you're embroiled in a crisis right now, I encourage you to use this time pre-crisis to do some reflection and to be thoughtful, right? Those plans that we write and create and execute that follow a period of reflection are so much more thorough, thoughtful, practical, and so forth. So as we reflect, I want you to start by thinking about, in a crisis, whose skills would be key to keeping us focused and effective? Whose skills? And I want you to think broadly in your agency. One of the mistakes that we all make from time to time is when we're trying to put together some sort of team, we just look at the org chart and we take that top level, the management team, right? And everybody on the management team winds up on our task force or our action team or planning team. And yet, in every agency, there are people with skills, really helpful skills, that live in different parts of the org chart. They are not on the management layer. They're not at the top of the org chart. Maybe they're near the bottom or somewhere in the middle. I want you to think about those skills and jot down who are some people that have some really relevant skills. Maybe they're very good writers. Maybe they're good at creating graphics, right? Illustrations of things. Maybe it's somebody who has kind of a systems approach to things, right? They're a systems problem solver, a systems thinker. I'm more of a logical thinker. I like things to go in step one, step two, step three. So give me a list of instructions, of directions. I'm good to go. Give me a map. I'm going to struggle. Do I turn left or right? But I like the exit your driveway and turn right and proceed for 100 feet. That's the kind of direction that I like. But you might want to find somebody with a systems way of thinking about things, somebody who's a problem solver, somebody with those great writing skills. So think about the skills. And then you also want to think about the style, right? In a crisis, which members of your team would you want in the room? And knowing the size of many community action agencies and having worked with several very closely, I know that you're going to have different personality types. You're going to have people who feel that everything's a crisis, right? Missing a deadline by 10 minutes is a crisis. And you're going to have other people who are really calm, who have this ability to just take it all in and figure out what next, and to be so level-headed. I think you want those level-headed folks on your crisis response team. So think about the skills you need, think about the style. And I also want you to give some thought to, is it possible that we'd want a different team to be that crisis ready response team based on the type of crisis we face, right? So if there's an allegation that we have misspent money coming from a government source, and allegation has been made, maybe it's by local media, maybe it's by a former employee, and suddenly there's a crisis related to our credibility and our ethics and our financial management practices and oversight, you probably want a team of people who have some insight into those issues and knowledge of what was done in those instances. And I would imagine you want very senior people involved in your crisis response team for something like that. But if you were to have a crisis involving a vehicle that your organization owns or a specific program in your organization, you might want to have somebody who runs that program or who manages your fleet of vehicles, right? So sometimes the makeup of that team differs based on the nature of the crisis. So give some thought to, would you need different teams based on the type of crisis? And don't overthink it. You could come up with categories such as a crisis related to our facilities, crisis related to safety and well-being. So someone gets hurt, terribly injured or killed while receiving services or delivering services. Something to do with finances. Use large buckets, right? Don't parse it so much that you've got one team for an earthquake and another team for a flood and another team for a fire. That's too much, right? And some of your agencies may be so small that you're thinking, it just doesn't make sense. We only need one crisis response team. And of course, that's completely up to you. Community action agencies have some similar programs and scope, but there are differences as well. So the next thing is to reflect. I'm sorry, we started with reflect. The next thing is to plan. All right, so we've thought about these issues. Now it's time to start planning. I want you to be thinking about what type of roadmap will be most helpful during a crisis. And how should the plan be structured to make it useful, right? Should it be a document that has lots and lots of information with a table of contents? Should it be a document full of checklists or bulleted lists? What type of roadmap? Should there be some sort of diagram? Should there be a decision tree, right? All of these things you get to decide. And then, of course, you're going to practice. This is the part that many of us don't do, right? We reflect, we create a plan, but we don't always practice. What did we learn from the last crisis? And have we baked in lessons learned from previous incidents? So I've shared with Ashley and Denise a fillable PDF worksheet that my team has created that will help you think about some of these issues and really tap into what you've learned from past incidents. So just going back to these three pieces, a little bit more information on the next few slides. In a crisis, we definitely need a savvy spokesperson, right? We definitely need people that have the authority to make decisions, right? We definitely need somebody who's good at rallying the team. But I want you to keep thinking about whose style, whose skills would be valuable. And, as you think about the makeup of the team and perhaps customizing it and having different crisis response teams based on the type of crisis at hand, you probably want to think about, do we need those behind the scenes planning types versus those who are more comfortable out front, right, representing the agency to an audience. Another way to think about putting this team together and whether you need one or more teams is you need to think about whether it makes sense to have one group of people create the plan, right, prepare the crisis plan, the crisis communications plan, kind of put together the document, and then another group of people who lead the organization through the crisis. Sometimes people that are great speakers and great leaders and really motivate aren't the best writers, aren't the best people to organize documents, aren't the best people to put together an operating procedure. So you might have two different teams. You might have a crisis planning team and a crisis response team, right? And this is, I wanted to point the second item out on this slide is that, you know, if you you don't have the flexibility to close programs and services where you have to continue offering services during a crisis or during a period of disruption, then you need people to run those programs and services while others are leading the agency through the crisis. So this is a common challenge that agencies face, that how do we keep running and offering services when I'm so busy focused on the crisis? So sometimes it's good to really parse those roles and make sure that you can continue to run those programs and services and yet still have a team, often a small team of people who are doing almost nothing but deal with the crisis. If you devote, you know, if you get the right people on the job and they're really focused and they're freed up from other responsibilities during this crisis, I think you're going to find that your handling of the crisis will be more effective and the crisis will soon be over, right? But if I'm trying to lead the crisis team while still managing, right, our Head Start program, our transportation program, one of the programs we offer, I'm going to struggle because every single day I'm going to be going back and forth between two different things, two different areas of focus. So as we go back to this second phase, the second lens of planning, I mentioned I want you to think about what type of plan would be helpful. You know, is it a roadmap? Is it a checklist? Is it to-do lists that say, if this type of crisis happens, this is what we will do? Is it a contingency plan or a business continuity plan, right? I was just speaking with an organization this morning whose chief financial officer told me that what they learned during the global pandemic is that they had plans to keep things going during this very difficult period of time and with all the challenges related to COVID. He said, we had all these plans and they worked pretty well, but none of them were written down. So we were very fortunate that our team members were available and nobody was ill or nobody had to take time off because people that knew what to do were available to do the work and keep things going. But he said it would have been really nice to have everything written down so that if we had a vacancy, someone else could step in. And we could go back and say, how did this work? And where would we tweak this plan? Was it helpful? Should it be updated? What was missing? He said, but nothing's been written down. So my team is working with him to try to start to write things down and document those plans. Definitely give some thought to the structure of your plan. And, you know, we use this term plan, it means something different to everybody. You know, sometimes a plan is a series of narratives, right? Sentences and paragraphs, what to do and what to say, reminders, do's and don'ts. We've been working with a couple of agencies recently that really like the idea of a decision tree. You know, ask yourself these questions. If this is true, go here. If this is true, go over here, right? So this is a crisis for which the board may be asked to make a decision, to allocate funds, to change our direction, to abandon a strategic priority. Then we need to bring this to the board. But if it's not that type of crisis, well, then we're going to take a different path. So I do think a decision tree can be really helpful. It's kind of an if this, then that type of structure. So if you like decision trees or if you've used them in other parts of your agency, you may find a decision tree format could be very helpful in your crisis plan. So the other thing I wanted to say is this idea of a table of contents and an index, right? A table of contents is great because you can see right away, okay, I'm focused on something related to facilities. I go to page 10. An index is also helpful, where you can just look at that word and go back and find it in the document. Of course, we all use the search feature if it's a searchable document, so that's also helpful if it's in a digital format. And I do think it's important to think about, how should this crisis response team differ from the management team? And don't, fall into this trap of just saying, well, obviously our crisis team would be our management team, right? That's certainly the case for many organizations, but then they run into difficulty when those managers have two masters. They have to keep running the finance department, have to keep running certain programs, and then they're pulled away to deal with the crisis. So as we practice this third phase that I mentioned a few minutes ago, it is so important to stop and learn from what we've experienced in the past. And I'm a huge believer in learning from experience. One of my favorite quotes is from Paul Shoemaker, who teaches at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. Shoemaker says, "Experience is inevitable. Learning is not." I love that quote. Experience is inevitable. Learning is not. And what he's reminding us is that each and every day we have experiences. We experience things, from losing our keys to losing our way, as we're trying to navigate and go somewhere. We all have experiences in terms of a difficult conversation we've had with somebody we work with, but do we learn from those experiences? And do we take time to reflect? And I think sometimes we don't allow ourselves the opportunity to reflect. And if we don't reflect, then we don't learn. Something else my team has been talking about lately is debriefing. Like, after we've completed either a big part of a project, or after we've wrapped up a project, just taking time to say, how did it go, right? What did we learn? What happened that was surprising? What didn't we know? We just wrapped a project where at the end of the project, we realized that all of the work we had done, we were reporting to a team that was not the management team. We were reporting to kind of a task force of staff members who don't have the authority to adopt our recommendations. So we've made all these recommendations to improve safety, and yet our gut feeling is that if the management team doesn't approve, none of them will get implemented. So it's always good to take time to reflect and debrief. I think it's also helpful to ask, how did the actual crisis, no matter what it was, an act of violence, a global pandemic, a weather event, a reputation crisis, how did that actual crisis differ from what we thought would happen, right? We all make kind of presumptions about how things will unfold. Maybe it's based on what we've experienced in the past. Maybe it's based on how another agency faced that same circumstances. Maybe it's based on something we heard, we read, we saw on television. So this tool that I provided is that lessons learned worksheet, and it's a fillable PDF, so you could ask multiple members of your team to fill it out, and then gather together and really brainstorm and ask, what did we learn, right? What were the silver linings? What were the dark clouds? And to what degree have we baked in lessons from that last crisis? How did we do that, right? Where is the evidence that we learned a lot, and what more do we need to do to really learn? As you think about this crisis plan, you want to think about both substance and style, right? So the substance, what's covered? Is it a true contingency plan, right? With backup plans for where we will go, how we will operate, how we will staff programs when certain folks are missing? Is it focused mainly on communications? Does it contain talking points? So people that are trained to be our spokespersons can just follow those talking points. Would it include a short video message? Do we intend to convene town hall meetings involving everybody in the agency, maybe all staff, maybe even extending that out to the board and others? So substance and style are really important as well, different considerations. This is that lessons learned worksheet that I mentioned. And the first column asks you to identify, are you kind of unpacking a success, a near miss, or a failure? Right? What was the bottom line, right? And then we ask you to fill in, what were you trying to accomplish? What were you trying to learn? And what were some of the causes? And you'll notice in the possible causes column, I've got bullet points because I'm just reminding you, I'm trying to signal you that there can be multiple causes of a success, a near miss, or a failure. And we want to avoid that tendency to ascribe or to simplify, to oversimplify and blame a failure on, Melanie. Melanie didn't know how to do the job, or Melanie made a mistake, right? There's often this tendency to blame a human being, because every mistake, every failure has fingerprints on it. And it's somewhat easy for us to figure out whose fingerprints are on it. When in reality, the causes of failure are usually pretty complicated, and there are multiple causes of most failures and mistakes. And then the most important part of this worksheet is that fourth column, which is the what can we learn from this? And this worksheet asks you to fill this in. And again, it's a fillable PDF, so that's the shaded area, tells you that you can type as much information as you want. Again, you could do this as a workshop with people gathered around the virtual table or in person, and just brainstorm, think out loud, or each person could fill it out separately, and then you could share information. So lots of different ways to use this worksheet. All right, let's talk about equipping your team. So this is all about how do we get this team of people that we've decided will be handling the crisis, or maybe planning for the crisis, developing the plan, or maybe doing both if you decided to put those two things together. How do we equip the team or those teams? So the first thing I want to remind you about is you want to make sure that this team has clear authority, right? What decisions is the team empowered to make? And are there decisions that require a higher authority? Somebody who isn't on the team needs to weigh in. And this was the very issue that we discovered with this client engagement, where we did all this work to try to make recommendations about safety, and we realized that the group we're reporting to has no authority to adopt any of the recommendations we made. I think another worthwhile area of focus is, what are the priorities, right? What is the team focused on? Is the crisis team focused on keeping people informed and up to date about what's happening? Is the crisis team focused on being a resource to staff who have questions in the middle of this crisis event? Is this team also responsible for debriefing and understanding what happened and how we handled it and how we can do this better, or how we can bake in some of the preparation or some of the things we learned during the crisis? And then another important piece is communications, right? Making sure that any messages communicated during a crisis are very direct, concise, and appropriate for the audience. And you've all been in this situation where things are kind of spinning out of control, and all of a sudden you get a 5-page email where you get some really dense text, or you get a message that's cold, right, that lacks empathy, or you get a message and you think, why are they sending this to me, right? We've all been there. And I think each of those experiences is a lesson that we need to just commit to clear communications. We need to be direct, we need to be truthful, we need to be concise, and we need to think about messages catered to the various audiences. So this slide has some tips from Peter Sandman and Jody Leonard, and they talk about these different types of messaging. And they say that during a crisis, your crisis team is often conveying information that has a different purpose. They said sometimes you're conveying what they call precaution advocacy. And these are the messages that are saying things like, watch out, right? There's a hazard, be careful. Right? Sometimes the message is what they call outrage management, which is where the communicator is saying, calm down, this is okay, we're gonna be okay, right? There's no need to be alarmed. And then the third type they call just crisis communication, but it's a subset, if you will. It's where we're telling people that we can do this, we're going to be okay, right? We're guiding people through hazards, but we're also trying to reassure them. So some additional tips that I thought would be helpful for your crisis ready response team is to, simplify the message, right? Don't send those 2,000 word emails with dense text. Don't send messages that are in all caps or very small print that nobody can read. And I think it's important to try to find these three these three messages, or these three elements in any message you send during a crisis, whether it's a press conference with the media, whether it's a town hall meeting with your staff, whether it's an emergency board meeting, with almost any audience you can imagine during a crisis. I think these three tips are really valuable. The first is, we care. This matters to us. This is important. The second is, we're here, right? During the early weeks and months of COVID-19, I was getting flooded with emails from all sorts of providers, from companies that sell office supplies to office equipment to insurance providers. I mean, you probably saw the same thing. And we were seeing television ads as well. And they all kind of said two things. They said, we care and we're here. We're open, right? We're working remotely, but we're open. And I know many of you sent those messages out to the community as well. And then the third message I think is super important, and that is, here's how you could help. Some nonprofits were saying, we could use your help. We could really use your financial donations, but there may be other ways that people can help. So great things to think about as you're crafting any message during a crisis. Now, that quote at the bottom of the photo has been attributed to Marie Antoinette. It's highly likely she didn't actually say this, but it's always frequently attributed to her. When everyone else is losing their heads, it's important to keep yours. And it's such a great motto for the crisis response team. The people that are managing a crisis and helping guide your agency through a crisis need to be people that can keep their heads, right? Not kind of lose it and get flustered. So as you develop messages during a crisis, and as you respond, I want you to remember kind of who, what, and how. And so I've created this little chart. Start with who. Who needs to hear from you? And I've put some possible groupings across the top. Clients, staff, funders, maybe the general public and the media. This chart could be a lot longer and have more categories, but you want to think about that. You also want to think then about, what do they need to hear? What do they need to know? And what will you say? So that what piece is really substantial and it's really important. You could gather a team. You could gather your crisis planning team or your crisis response team, or again, a task force of people that are interested in this subject around a table and just brainstorm. Who are the audiences, and then what does each of those audiences want to hear? What are the types of questions we're likely to get? What did we get when COVID-19 started? What are the phone logs show? And then it's also important to close the loop with, how will we reach these audiences, right? Will we publish videos? Will we make phone calls? Will we use communications applications? Will we post things on our website? Will we issue press releases? Probably all of the above. But all of those different methods are not going to be suited to every audience. So I think it's helpful to kind of parse that out. And that chart may be helpful. I hope it is. So as you think about what to communicate, what your crisis ready response team will be communicating in a crisis, I want you to think about these two different categories. The first is, you need to communicate about the event. What has happened, right? Whether it's COVID-19 or severe weather or any other crisis you can imagine. Make sure that you know and you have in mind some credible sources of information for these different types of events. So if it is an active shooter event, maybe your source of information is the FBI or the local sheriff's department, or a statewide law enforcement agency. If it is COVID-19 or a variant of COVID-19 or another health crisis, it should be the Centers for Disease Control, maybe the Department of Health and Human Services, your local public health agency. So just make sure that you have in mind credible sources of information for the various types of crisis events that could happen to your agency or happen in your agency. And I would include contact information for those sources in your crisis plan. The second major kind of category of information you want to communicate during a crisis is all about you, right? So it's about what's happening, what you're doing to protect people, how you imagine or expect your audience to be impacted, your clientele to be impacted. And the bottom line is that your response to very different crisis events may be sort of similar, right? You may curtail programs, you may close, regardless of the type of weather event, but during any severe weather event. And knowing that your responses are likely to be similar or maybe similar or overlap, regardless of the type of crisis, you could put together those responses now and just tweak them when the crisis happens. One of the books that I read last year that I really enjoyed is called Questions Are the Answer by Hal Gregerson, who teaches at MIT. And he just reminds us that it's important to remind yourself and admit and embrace the idea of being a little wrong, right? And when you're in a situation where you don't have all the answers and you're less comfortable, you're going to have more questions. And the bottom line of this book is that we get to better answers if we ask better questions. And the only way to ask better questions is to be humble and to recognize that we don't have all the answers. We don't know. We haven't experienced everything. And even if we've experienced one type of crisis, the second time it happens, the experience may be quite different. I love that guidance from Hal Gregerson. So one of the things that community action agencies are expected to do, and one of the things we say we do, and we tout, is that we are transparent and that we believe in this value of transparency. So I wanted to share a few tips on this. The first is that in any instance during a crisis that you're communicating information or your spokesperson is communicating information, you want to make sure that you're providing enough information or detail to be informative. But if you get into the weeds, if you get into the minutia of the situation, you're going to lose people. So you want to be kind of at a high level, but you want to provide a window into what's happening. And my tip is that you try to be as transparent as possible. You know, one of the worst things is to hear someone say that they're being transparent or talk about this commitment to transparency, when in reality, they're being pretty opaque, right? They're not telling anything. So if you're not able to be transparent, don't say that you're being transparent, right? But keep in mind, if your organization has made a commitment to transparency, you need to be able to say as much as you possibly can. And that includes sometimes how you reached a decision. You know, we spent the last 2 days giving this a lot of thought, and it was very hard to make this decision, but in evaluating our capacity, in evaluating the stress, in evaluating the circumstances, we decided we needed to close this program. We decided we needed to take this program offline, right? So people can accept really tough news if you're compassionate and if you're willing to explain how you reached that difficult decision. I think you'll find a lot of support when you take that step. Make sure anytime you're conveying difficult information that you do provide an opportunity to ask questions. We've all watched a news conference conducted by public officials or conducted by someone from law enforcement where somebody stands at the podium and they read a short speech and then they say, "We're not taking any questions," and they walk away. And of course, what happens? All of the reporters that are standing around the podium or who've gathered for the press conference raise their hands in the hope that maybe there will be an opportunity for questions. When you don't take questions, it leaves a bad taste in everybody's mouth, right? Everybody feels like, wow, they only told us what they wanted us to hear. Or that briefing was very scripted, it's very formal, right? Very controlled. And you should always provide an opportunity to ask questions. Now, it doesn't have to be right there and then at the end of the press conference, but you could always provide a phone number or an email address. Send us your questions. We will answer questions one-on-one after the briefing. Here's the phone number. Here's the person to contact. And the last tip on this slide is that when people ask questions, you want to listen carefully. One of the things I found from providing technical assistance to not only community action agencies, but lots of other nonprofit organizations and leaders from across the nonprofit and public sectors is that sometimes people call with a question, but the very first question they ask is not the real question. It's a lead into the real question. It's a hint at what is to come. And sometimes it takes somebody time to kind of get to the real question. And you have to be patient. You have to listen and be willing to let somebody speak. A really important part of preparing this crisis-ready response team is to make sure that you've clarified who is your spokesperson. And typically there are 1 or 2 or 3 people who are authorized to represent the organization. And typically these are not members of your board of directors. Typically it's the CEO, the executive director of the agency, and 1 or 2 other people. You always need a backup in case that number 1 person is not available. And but it should be a limited number of people, and it may be a member of your board. It may be that your board chair is somebody who has lots of experience serving as a spokesperson, and this person knows so much about what you do and is absolutely in sync with what's happening in the agency and very up to date. These individuals should have some training. Certainly they should get together and talk about the approach, what they're going to do, what they won't do, read as much as they can about being spokespersons. And in some cases, and often in many cases, I'll say, it is the executive director of the agency, but sometimes it isn't. And in cases where it shouldn't be the executive director, that might be because that person just is a great manager, but doesn't like to be in front of a camera or be on the radio or give an interview, or just really gets crazy nervous and jumbled when those opportunities arise. Another reason I've seen where it doesn't make sense to have the executive director be your spokesperson is where that person doesn't convey empathy easily. And another way to think about this is where that person comes across as a little cold. And I'm sure you've all worked with somebody who maybe had a big heart, but in the way they spoke to people, in the way they presented themselves, they come across as being a little cold. And I experienced that years ago with an executive director. I was asked by the national office of a nonprofit to speak to an executive director in the wake of a tragedy. And when I spoke to that executive director, my gut instinct was she was very cold. She was very cold. She said some things that just really I found very chilling. And so when I called the national office back, I said, unfortunately, I know she says she has lots of experience in media relations, but she comes across as very cold and uncaring. And I told them I would not put her in front of the camera because I worry that people watching her talk about this horrible tragedy will not feel that the agency is doing the right thing. So the other piece of this is that anybody who's not the spokesperson should know it. And don't be surprised if you have staff members and board members who are absolutely happy to speak up and represent your agency at a moment's notice and don't realize that they're not supposed to be the spokesperson. So these are some tips, rules of thumb for the crisis team. Communication, right? Keeping those communication lines open, showing empathy, being transparent. And that includes saying things like, we don't know, or I don't have the answer to that, but I will get back to you. I will absolutely look into that and see what I can find. Please know that it's absolutely okay to say things like that. So when you're in the spotlight, right, if you don't know, you should say so and try to find out. You should be sincere and compassionate, and not just when your own stakeholders have been hurt, but when some injury, illness, death has happened in your community. You need to be sincere and compassionate. And I'll just give you an example. I've worked with a couple of agencies where a former employee or a former volunteer has been arrested for committing child molestation, for harming a child. And I've worked with one organization that said, even though none of our children were hurt, nobody in our program was hurt by this predator, he caused grievous harm to other children. And a child who's been hurt anywhere is a child who's, is a horrible tragedy. That's the right message in that instance, even though no one in your organization was harmed that you know of. But I've also seen a different response where an agency says, this predator has been arrested, but no one in our agency was hurt. So we have nothing further to say, right? As if they're saying it's not our problem, right? Yes, he used to work here, but as far as we know, nobody's been hurt here. All the victims were somewhere else. That just comes across as so cold, so cold. I want to encourage you to accommodate reasonable requests. So if somebody says, could I do an interview in front of your building? It may not be the place you want to do the interview, but if it's possible to do it, understand that backdrop is really important for the story. And maybe the most important thing on this slide is that it's so important that we're willing to admit when mistakes have been made. If you want to sustain credibility and trust, it's okay to say, we made a mistake. We didn't know that was happening, or we didn't find out until today. And I know some of you are thinking that this is kind of weird advice coming from a lawyer, because so many lawyers will tell you don't admit liability. Well, admitting that a mistake was made is very different from saying we're liable, right? Go ahead and sue us and we'll pay you, right? It's very different from saying we made a mistake, right? We didn't realize this was happening. I think it's just so important. It helps you establish and reestablish credibility, or maintain and sustain credibility. So just another slide with some tips about staying on message. Again, showing that you care, showing that you're committed, being consistent. If you're inconsistent from one set of messages to the other, that can get you in trouble. If you speak in legalese or in jargon, that can get you into trouble. So be coherent, and clarity and coherence kind of go hand in hand. Be as clear as possible. All right, I want to close this session with a few tips and takeaways. The first is from an article by Nancy Kean, who wrote, Real Leaders Are Forged in Crisis, for the Harvard Business Review. And in this article, she talks about the idea that the job of a leader in a crisis, so the job of that crisis response team, is to provide brutal honesty and credible hope, right? Brutal honesty. I love that phrase. This is what happened, right? This is what happened. And hope that we are going to work on this. We're going to work together to get through this. And so it's those two, you're kind of navigating those two pathways. And she adds that it's okay to say, this is a scary time, right? We don't know what's going to happen next, but we're going to work together to weather the storm. So I love that sentiment. The next tip is, it's so important to be patient and forgiving, and not only with others, but with ourselves. And, people make mistakes. Things don't go well. We face catastrophes and disasters and things that were human caused, right? Human beings are at the behind so many things that go wrong. But often it's not that somebody was dumb or that they weren't committed or they weren't professional. It's that they were bombarded with so many things at once that they weren't able to focus on the most important task at hand. And I think that living through mistakes helps you build resilience. And this whole series is about resilience, that as you experience mistakes, you become more and more resilient. And the truth is, an agency that has never faced a crisis, is it resilient? We don't know, right? We don't know until that crisis actually happens. And this was, again, from Nancy Kean's article, Real Leaders Are Forged in Crisis, this idea that a crisis takes the toll on you, and it can lead to burnout. And an important part of being a leader in a crisis environment, and I would encourage you to share this quote and share this sentiment with the crisis response team that you're creating for your agency. Share this sentiment that part of the team's job is to kind of keep their fingers on the pulse of the energy and the emotions of the team. One of the ways we did this during COVID-19 was during our Zoom meetings. If I noticed that one of my staff looked a little down or looked distracted or sad, I tried to pick up the phone after the staff meeting to say, how are you doing? Are you okay? Right? And I think I got better at that in video meetings than I was when we were meeting in a conference room. Because we're meeting in a conference room, I wasn't making eye contact with the team for an hour. I was looking around the room and looking down. But on Zoom, I try to be very focused on the people in the room and make a lot of eye contact. So I think I've gotten better at picking up kind of mood issues. But that's one of the responsibilities of a leader, is to keep our fingers on the pulse of the energy and emotions and respond as needed. So these were two books that I wanted to recommend. The one I mentioned before, Questions Are the Answer, by Hal Gregerson. And he says this wonderful quote that I've shared here is all about how sometimes we don't ask questions because we don't want to confront the fact that we're not doing things as well as we should. There is an opportunity to improve. And then this other book is What Philosophy Can Teach You About Being a Better Leader. And, they remind us, the authors of this book, it's a great book. If you ever studied philosophy or you never studied philosophy, and I fall into that second category, I learned so much about philosophers over the ages. but they talk about showing up as that vulnerable and fallible leader who doesn't have all the answers, and you allow others to show up in that fashion as well. And in Hal Gregerson's book, he talks about these humble questions, and I kind of adapted them for this presentation. You know, whose perspective is missing? How do I make sure that surprising information keeps coming to me? If people think that I'm going to reject any surprising information or negative information, they will stop sharing that information and I will be in the dark. Do people tell me when I'm wrong? What am I failing to ask about? How do I encourage this kind of imaginative probing of assumptions? Right? Do we think about the assumptions that we've made? And then I think this is my last takeaway, is to try to stay future focused and positive. And, you know, I think there are so many silver linings to the mistakes that we make, to the crisis events that we get through. I hope your crisis response team is future focused and recognizes that although their main job is to deal with a crisis in the here and now, another really important part of what they do is to think about how do we grow stronger and more effective as an agency? How do we build resilience? How do we learn from mistakes? And how do we remain optimistic? How do we find those silver linings behind those dark clouds and just become a stronger and more effective agency, better able to serve our community? So that's it for me. You've got my contact information on this slide as well. So I want to turn it back over to Ashley.
Thank you, Melanie, for giving us such excellent information about crisis communications and the importance of having solid strategies in place so that we can build and equip crisis-ready response teams. We really appreciate that today. It does not look like we have any questions in the chat, but Denise did make sure that your email address was in the chat so people can contact you afterwards. Sometimes it takes a little bit to process the information, so we gave your information out there. So to wrap up today's webinar, we do have a few things to make sure you all are aware of. Number 7 in this series is coming up on August 19th. It's called Accessing Resilience Resources from Public and Private Sources. That's at 2 Eastern. And we then have, sorry, you can go to the next slide, thank you. And then we have How to Become the Resilient Leader Your Mission Requires. And that is number 8 in the 8-part series in September. So you'll definitely want to make sure that you sign up for both of those. The information is on our website. That one is September 16th at 2 o'clock Eastern, 11 o'clock a.m. Pacific. You can go to the next slide. We also have leadership coaching and technical assistance. It's one of these new CARES programs that we've decided to implement. It's new executive directors, and you can talk with a peer expert that you might be able to get some good ideas from. If you have any questions about that, you can email Lana Shope or Lily Seals. Go to the next slide. And then, of course, for more information on anything that our CARES project team is doing, you are welcome to contact Erin Wicks, Lana Shope, or myself, and our emails are on this slide. So I think that's it. Melanie, do you have any last minute things you'd like to tell the group?
No, I guess other than don't be overwhelmed, right? I've covered lots of content. I've talked about the possibility of maybe having a crisis planning team, a crisis response team, coming up with those messages. You know, just resolve to take one step, right? Identify what's my next step, what's something that makes sense. Maybe it's looking at how you handle the crisis. Maybe it's using that worksheet that I shared today. But don't take too many bites of the apple, right? Just try to identify 1 or 2 follow-up items that you can do and pursue in the next few weeks, and make sure you're reaching out for help if you encounter any difficulties. I'm always here as a resource.
Solid advice, Melanie. Thank you. And thank you to our attendees for joining us today. We'll see you at the next Resilience Toolkit Series webinar, and don't forget to fill out our survey afterward. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.